In April of this year, I found out that someone was making a mod where he could travel past 2 to the 63 in-game for the first time. As it turns out, the Far Lands have a Far Lands of their own. Now I know what you're thinking, that's of course that's the Farver Lands, but the Farver Lands are actually an independent phenomenon whose appearance as a layer of the Far Lands is only because it happens to be much further located. There is in fact another phenomenon that I think the description of Far Lands of the Far Lands better fits. To find out what would happen in Java Edition's Far Lands beyond 2 to the 63, we first had to investigate the oddity that was the Bedrock Edition Far Lands. If you remember, in Bedrock Edition, the Far Lands generated a bit differently. The edge Far Lands near their initiation would look very similar to Java Editions. However, after about 9,000 blocks or so, the Far Lands would begin to deteriorate into what I refer to as the Fringe Lands. The first stage of the degrading would occur at 12,559,913 on the x-axis. The second stage of the degrading would occur at 12,560,361, where more comb-like structures would appear. The third stage of the degrading would occur at 12,561,029, where the Far Lands really begin to thin out. The fourth stage of degrading would occur at 12,562,277, where the terrain thins out even further into one block dotted or solid lines. And finally, the Far Lands would dissipate entirely at 12,758,545 on the x-axis. At first, I believed this to be a Bedrock Edition exclusive phenomenon. However, in early March of 2021, after reading about the cause of the Far Lands, particularly the tidbit about the fraction being increasing beyond 1 and being plugged into a quintic equation, just for fun, I calculated what the value of the quintic applied to the noise coordinate fraction would be by 12,758,545, which is right here. And it turns out that when we take the fraction of the noise coordinate by this point, which is about 35.5 million, and plug it into this equation 6x to the 5th minus 15x to the 4 plus 10x cubed, we get about 3.4 times 10 to the 38th. Huh, that number looks familiar. It is almost exactly the hard limit for a 32-bit float. This could not be a coincidence. This is in fact the cause of the dissipating Far Lands, which again I refer to as the Fringe Lands. In the corners, the degrading would happen almost immediately, giving way to a matrix similar to Seth Bling's old challenge map, skygrid. We can see a bit of the stack generating with a small mathematical curve right before the skygrid begins. The usual diagonal lines of the corner Far Lands would also continue into the skygrid, and you could rarely find a 4-block strip near a diagonal line. And the reason for that is because the noise values are smaller near the major diagonal lines, near the diagonal lines that occur at y coordinates divisible by 8. So again, the noise fraction is plugged into the coordinate fraction values, plugged into this quintic equation, where even when the remainder is a few hundred, it's already in the trillions, and when the remainder is a couple thousand, and even when the remainder is a few thousand, it is already in the quintillions. And these values are multiplied together on both axes, as I explained a little bit earlier when I was discussing the cause of the Far Lands. This is why the corner Far Lands dissipate much more quickly than the edge Far Lands, of course. And at 12,562,277 on both axes, the sky grid would almost completely thin out. On the z-axis, the degrading was much more gradual. and at 12,758,545, the terrain would only dissipate into a skygrid similar to the one in the corner Far Lands, albeit visibly a bit more stretched out. Java Edition uses doubles, which do not overflow until 2 to 1024, so its Far Lands dissipate much, much, much further out. The corner Far Lands begin dissipating at around 40 septillion blocks out on both axes, a distance of over 4.2 billion light years. The Far Lands dissipate earlier when traveling along both axes because the quintic values are multiplied together in the calculations. By around 45 septillion blocks out, the corner Far Lands fully dissipate into a skygrid like in Bedrock Edition. Note that in the skygrid, blocks only generate at x and z coordinates divisible by 4, and at y coordinates divisible by 8. This corresponds directly to the noise sampling intervals. I actually noticed this in the Pocket Edition skygrid back in early 2016. Now, early in the corner Fringe Lands, we can find many artifacts such as pillars and thin layers before the terrain completely dissipates into the skygrid. Now, early in the corner Fringe Lands, we can see many artifacts such as thin layers and pillars before the terrain completely dissipates into the skygrid. Also note the spikes that can appear in the corner Fringe Lands, especially when we view them by coordinate scaling. These appear because the noise values at that layer actually get smaller as we approach a diagonal line at a y level divisible by 8, as the diagonal line is actually when they reach 0, and this causes the overflow to occur further out. However, the skygrid itself begins to thin out as we travel further along. This is not like the end of the skygrid in the Bedrock Edition Far Lands, which was actually caused by reaching the coordinates of the X Fringe Lands within the corner Far Land. This is actually the same phenomenon happening again for additional octaves of low and high noise. The additional octaves had only rare noticeable effects in the Far Lands, but they have major effects in the Fringe Lands. While the corner Fringe Lands usually dissipate by around 300 or maybe 500 septillion on both axes, some material can rarely generate further out. Like here we see the corner Fringe Lands do not dissipate until about 536 or 537 septillion blocks out on both axes. However, this seed has one layer of the skygrid still generating 1 octillion blocks out on both axes. Quintic values are multiplied together in the calculations. The coordinate where the Far Lands begin disintegrating varies depending on the other axis. The closer the other axis is to 12,550,824, the further out the Far Lands will degrade. This makes sense because when one axis is closer to 12,550,824, its fraction value and corresponding quintic value will be smaller. For instance, when at the boundary between the edge and corner Far Lands, that is about 1,4,065,900 on the other axis, the Far Lands will not dissipate until about 3.3 times 10 to the 39th blocks out on the main axis, and don't completely fade out until much further. Here is 3.4 times 10 to the 39th on the x-axis and 1.04 billion on the z. Now here's 5 times 10 to the 39th on the x-axis and 1.004 billion on the z. Notice how the Fringe Lands, or as this region of the Fringe Lands is named, the Fringe Far Lands, have become a bit slightly thinner. There is actually a very accurate mathematical formula to determine where the Far Lands will dissipate when both axes are greater than 12,550,824. Given a certain z coordinate, which we'll just call z, take z minus 12,550,824, and then multiply that by 171.103, which is equivalent to simply taking z times 171.103 and subtracting 2 to the 31. Then take that number to the 5th power and multiply by 6. Then take 2 to the 1024 divided by 6 and divide that by that outcome, by 6 times that z fraction to the 5th. Then divide that number by 6 and take the 6th root. Then divide that by 171.103, and you have your x coordinate where the fringe lands will appear at that b coordinate. We can do the same for a given x coordinate, finding where the fringe lands will appear on the z-axis. It's the same thing, only switch the 5th and the 6th roots. That is, we could just take x minus 12,560,824, then multiply by 171.103, then take 6 times that to the 6th power, then divide 2 to 1024 divided by 6 by that, then divide by 6 and take the 5th root, and then divide by 171.103. And indeed, the point where the corner fringe lands appear when traveling on both axes is closely approximated by the 11th root of 2 to the 1024 over 36, which would come from the product of 6 times the x fraction to the 6th, and with 6 times the z fraction to the 5th. And now for the edge fringe lands. The first stage of degrading in the x-axis, the equivalent of 12,559,913 in Bedrock Edition, is of course at this number, approximately 8.175 quintillion blocks out. That's 8.175 trillion. Whoa. There is no physical comparison for that distance. The second phase of the degrading occurs at approximately 8.576 quintillion on the x-axis. This is the equivalent of 12,560,361 in Bedrock Edition. The third stage of the degrading would occur at approximately 9.17624 quintillion. This being the equivalent of 12,561,029 in Bedrock Edition here. The fourth stage of the degrading occurs at nearly 10.3 quintillion blocks out on the x-axis. This is the equivalent of 12,562,277 in Bedrock Edition. Now, the true equivalent of 12,758,545 for Bedrock Edition and Java Edition would be about 1.828332746 times 10 to the 59th blocks out. However, as you can see here, the additional octaves fringe lands cause the terrain to dissipate completely well before this. In the X fringe lands, it is rare but possible to find dotted lines continuing past 2.06 times 10 to the 49th. Most of these will stop around 3.3 times 10 to the 49th in the x-axis, although some may stop at a very specific number, 3.14016 approximately times 10 to the 49th. That is actually the equivalent of 9.17624 times 10 to the 48th for depth noise. So, if you recall, depth noise has basically no effect on the Far Lands when it overflows, but it does have effect. But its fringe lands do have some effect on the fringe lands. On the z-axis, the degrading is much more gradual, with the degrading beginning around 9.176 quintillion blocks out on the z-axis. The terrain will gradually thin out, with many more comb-like artifacts generating at 10.3 quintillion on the z-axis. By 15 quintillion, the Far Lands have almost entirely thinned out. The Z Far Lands have almost entirely thinned out, giving way to several comb-like artifacts, pillars, and sky and dotted lines. By 25 quindecillion, nearly all cone-like artifacts have dissipated, and only the skygrid remains. However, once additional octaves have their own fringe lands, the skygrid itself thinned out. Here is 100 quindecillion on the z-axis. Notice how only some isolated strips of the skygrid remain. And of course, there's more underwater because of the biome Far Lands, which will delete any artifact that's 1 block thick if it is stone. And finally, here is 1 sextillion on the z, or 10 to the 51 on the z. And finally, here's 1 sextillion, or 10 to the 51 on the z-axis. Almost nothing generates out this far, except for the ocean, except for the primordial ocean, as I call it. It is possible to find some strips of the skygrid remaining this far out, but it is pretty rare. The farthest anyone has seen any material generating in the Z fringe lands, as far as I know, is 2.359 times 10 to the 51. So to summarize, the fringe lands are caused by floating point overflows, not precision loss, overflows, related to the quintic equation used in Minecraft's Perlin noise algorithm. Oh, and there's a strip of skygrid still generating at 10 to the 51. Actually. So, the earlier stages of the fringe lands are caused by the several stacked lerp functions in Minecraft's Perlin noise algorithm. This also explains why the fringe lands appear closer to the 6th root of 2 to the 1024 over 6, all divided by 171.103, rather than the 5th root. Rather than the 5th root of that over 171.103. Because the fraction is, the quintic is multiplied by the fraction value again during the calculations at the lerp functions. And the first stage of the on the x-axis, the first stage of the fringe lands on the x-axis will appear at roughly 1 over 171.103 of the 6th root of 2 to the 1024 over 24. The second stage at roughly 1 over 171.103 of the 6th root of 2 to the 1024 over 18. The third stage at 1 over 171.103 of the 6th root of 2 to the 1024 over 12. And the fourth stage at 1 over 171.103 of the 6th root of 2 to the 1024 over 6. Woo. The first two stages of the X fringe lands are also related to the grad functions, as I found when fixing the last couple inaccuracies of the Bedrock Edition noise type in this mod. Now, the reason why the degrading is more gradual on the z-axis is because the first 4 of these lerp functions all use the x quintic as the parameter. That is the c in c times b minus a, all plus a. And in the z far lands, the x quintic, since the x fraction will still be in the normal range of 0 to 1, the quintic will also be in the normal range. And in the corner far lands, and particularly the corner fringe lands, so this applies to the entirety of the corner far land, pretty much. Of course, the x quintic will be large, but not overflowing, and terms related to the x quintic will not be overflowing. In the sky dimension corner fringe lands, we can see how the blocks in the sky grid only appear at blocks divisible by 8 on the x and z axes, and of course at blocks divisible by 4, not necessarily by 8 on the y-axis. Some grass blocks near the bottom of the sky dimension can also be randomly replaced with lava, which can result in these lava fountains appearing within the sky dimension fringe lands near the bottom of the sky grid. And here is the X fringe lands in the sky dimension, which look very similar to their overworld counterparts, except of course with the artifacts every 8 blocks on the x-axis and every 4 blocks on the y, and only 4 blocks tall usually on the y. In later versions, the Fringe Lands would generate without the comb-like artifacts and skygrids, due to a change in the way a certain function that places the blocks in the chunks was written. However, by changing that function, which can be found in Chunk Generator Overworld, in this version, we can bring back the skygrid and comb-like artifacts, as we see here, and we can see the skygrid generating all the way up to y equals 256, or more accurately 248. But yeah. In versions where the Fringe Lands generated without the comb-like artifacts, at 9.176 quindecillion blocks out in the x-axis, or 12,561,029 in Bedrock Edition, the terrain would simply thin out to these two-dimensional strips of land, which would mostly be 1 block thick vertically, and a few blocks wide. Here's a village in the Fringe Lands as well, with the buildings extending all the way up from sea level to almost the height limit. And at 10.299 quindecillion blocks out on the x-axis, or 12,562,277 in Bedrock Edition, the strips of land would come to a stop, and the Fringe Lands would almost entirely disappear except for some very isolated strips of land. So it is actually not only the comb-like artifacts that are affected, but any artifact that's only 1 block wide. It's only 1 block wide on the z-axis, essentially, basically. Well, not any artifact, apparently. There is a 1 block wide strip right here, but most of the artifacts that are 1 block wide on the z-axis are affected as well. Now, you may be wondering, what if we bring the Sky Far Lands into this? Well, in that case, we get the Sky Fringe Lands, which appear at about twice the usual Fringe Lands coordinate on the y-axis. These look like the usual Fringe Lands, but of course lopsided. The Sky Far Lands will begin dissipating at around 2 times 10 to the 49th blocks up on the y-axis, and will gradually thin out into these huge towers with comb-like artifacts, 4 block lines, and dotted columns resembling the skygrid. Notice how the artifacts are every 8 blocks on the y-axis, once again because of the noise being sampled every 8 blocks on the y-axis. Here's the Sky Corner Fringe Lands as they would appear at roughly 10 to the 25 on the y-axis and 10 to the 27 on the z-axis. They look similar to the usual corner Fringe Lands, but sideways. And finally, here's the Vertex Fringe Lands, which appear as a huge mathematical curve, a 3D mathematical curve resembling a giant stadium, which leads into a perfect skygrid, and not like in the corner Fringe Lands. Here we actually see blocks at every multiple of 8 on the y-axis. These will appear at roughly 100 quadrillion when traveling on all 3 axes, which is even earlier than the corner Fringe Lands because the noise values in the Vertex Far Lands can be as large as on the order of the quintic values to the 15th power, because all 3 of them are multiplied together. Notice how once again we can sometimes find spikes in the corner Fringe Lands. Notice how we can once again sometimes find spikes in the Vertex Fringe Lands near these huge diagonal walls, because these again correspond to the noise values being much smaller. And here's what the Void Vertex Fringe Lands would look like. They look exactly identical to their sky counterparts, except upside down and flooded. And if we can get inside the block, and if we can get right up by the edge of the block here, we can get an X-ray.